In this video, we'll talk about supply curve shifters. Just like we talked about demand curve shifters or the factors that shifted the demand curve, we'll talk about factors that shifted the supply curve. Okay, so once again, we want to always make sure we understand the distinction between movement along the curve versus the shift of the curve. So when we're talking about the supply curve, we're thinking like sellers. And let's say we were talking about lattes, and this is for $3. I think we were supplying 15, and let's say the price went up, and at that price we're supplying 25. Okay, so notice that there is a movement from point A to point B because of a change in price. Okay, so whenever price, which appears on the y-axis, is changing, there is a movement along the supply curve. Okay, but there are factors that don't appear on the axis that can cause the shift to happen. Okay, so the idea here is to remember that any change that raises the quantity that sellers wish to produce at any given price shift the supply to the right, shift the supply curve to the right. Okay, and similarly, any change that lowers the quantity that sellers wish to produce at any given price would shift the supply curve to the left. Okay, so any shift like this from S to S2, or let's call this S1, S1 to S2, is an increase in supply. Right? You can also see this by looking at what's going on at the price point of $5. At $5, we were at point B, and now we are at point C with the new supply curve. Right? At this point, we might be willing to supply 35 lattes. Okay, and similarly, if we wanted to think about a decrease in supply would be a shift of the supply curve to the left, where at $5 we are supplying less than point B. Okay, so let's move on and talk about some of the supply curve shifters. So there are 4 supply curve shifters that we'll talk about. The first one being the number of sellers, followed by input prices, technology, and expectations about the future. So let's talk about the number of sellers first. Okay, so let's say we were talking about ice cream, and maybe earlier we only had Mitchell's ice cream and Bi-Rite ice cream, and these were the only 2 sellers of ice cream. And now we have many more. Okay, so we may have Smitten ice cream in Hayes Valley. If you haven't been, it's a nice place to go. Well, not now, but Smitten ice cream, where you can see ice cream getting made as well, and they have some really nice seasonal flavors, and also Salt and Straw. So what I'm trying to say here is, let's say earlier we only had 2 suppliers, and now we have 4 suppliers. So what's that going to do to the quantity of ice cream supplied? Now, our intuition tells us quantity supplied should increase, and so that is going to be reflected in a rightward shift of the supply curve. Okay? So an increase in the number of sellers raises quantity supplied, or increases quantity supplied at any given price point. Okay, so earlier at price P1, Q1 was what was supplied, and now it's Q2. Okay, and Q2 is greater than Q1. You could think about the opposite scenario, which is if there was a decrease in the number of sellers, if Bi-Rite found it very difficult to survive in San Francisco. Well, that's never going to happen. But let's say Salt and Straw found it very difficult to survive in San Francisco because of high rents. Then the quantity supplied will decrease if they relocated to another city. Okay, and the supply curve would shift to the left. Next, we talk about input prices. So again, if we think about ice cream, and we are thinking about the supply of ice cream, we can think about any raw materials that go into the production of ice cream. So for example, to produce the output of ice cream, sellers would use various inputs. Cream, sugar, different flavors, fruits, etc. Okay, and also this is not just all, right, in terms of raw materials, but there are obviously workers who are making this happen, creating ice cream or different flavors of ice cream, and mixing the ingredients and operating the machines. So we may also have ice cream making machines, and all of this is basically required to produce ice creams. Okay, so if the price of any input, goes up, these are all inputs, which is producing this output, which is ice cream. Okay, if the price of input goes up, then producing ice cream becomes less profitable. Okay, so it's less profitable to produce ice cream, and suppliers might respond by decreasing supply. So you might decrease supply because it's more expensive or it's more costly to produce ice cream. Okay, and if the input prices are rising substantially, a firm might shut down completely and supply no ice cream at all. Okay, so the supply of a good is negatively related to the price of the inputs used to make the good. Okay, so don't worry about that, but just focus on the logic here. So if the price of input is going up, then the supply curve is going to shift to the left, which means at any price point we are going to be willing to supply less ice creams than before. Okay, so let's talk about technology. So by technology we mean when we're using some type of machine in the production of ice creams. Again, if we are talking about ice cream, and we're rolling with the same example, any technology that requires turning those inputs into ice cream is also a determinant of supply, or another factor that shifts or has the potential to shift the supply curve. So if let's say you get some kind of an amazing machine which doesn't require a person to operate it, so all you need to do is put all the ingredients in one big bowl, and then the machine takes care of everything else. Okay, so you don't really need someone to intervene at every step of the ice cream making process. So it would reduce the amount of labor necessary to produce ice cream. So if we have better technology, example, some kind of an invention of a mechanized ice cream machine. This would reduce the amount of labor required to make the ice cream. Okay, and this is going to reduce the firm's costs and therefore increase the quantity supplied of ice cream. Okay, so you might be able to make more ice creams because this is cost-saving technology. So what an increase or better technology might do is that it incentivizes, let's say this was $5 a scoop. Earlier we were supplying Q1 and now we are able to supply more at that price. Okay, and finally we talk about expectations, and this also has the potential to affect the supply curve. So if you're thinking about expectations, the amount of ice cream a firm supplies today may depend on its expectations about the future. For example, if a firm expects the price of ice cream to rise in future, so future prices of ice cream would go up, let's say we know this, then it would put some of its current production into storage and supply less today. So the quantity supplied may go down today. Okay, and so the supply curve might shift to the left because of this. Okay, so there are many different applications of how supply curve shifters can shift the supply curve in your homework assignments.